Hi folks, so today we have a viewer question. Let me see if I can read this. Courtney Hahn writes in, do you think you could do a video talking about different formats like strips and pages, pros and cons of each, and your own personal preferences? So I'm going to be speaking about this from the perspective of a web cartoonist and publishing on the web, because it's what I'm most familiar with and it's where I find the most variety in terms of presenting material. Also, I'm probably going to use most words like most or, most popular, or this, that, and the other thing. Just know that I haven't done any sort of academic studies about this stuff. These are educated guesses on my part from being around the industry and doing comics, web comics for a while now. If you want a more informed, enlightened academic discussion about comics, check out this guy, Scott McCloud. He's written a whole bunch of books. There's, I think it's Discovering Comics, there's Reinventing Comics, there's Reading Comics, there's a whole bunch of books. It's all about like reinventing, reading, discovering. We'll talk about Scott McCloud later actually in this video because of things that he said about stuff. But yeah, so look him up. He's got a whole bunch of big books discussing comics in a more academic, enlightened arena. He's done more studies about this thing than I have. I'm not an academic by any stretch of the imagination. So if you want an educated opinion, go to Scott McCloud. If you want an opinion of someone who's been grinding it out in the trenches, listen to me for a little bit. So we'll get started. The most popular, or the most common and the most successful type of webcomic out there is what we call joke a day. Now, when you're doing a webcomic anyway, you're fighting for 30 seconds of attention, because honestly, most readers are going to read your comic in 30 seconds and then move on to something else. Or they're going to log in at the beginning of their workday, they're going to read something, or maybe it's their lunch hour where they only have a limited amount of time. So you're fighting for those 30 seconds. And in those 30 seconds, the types of comics that do really, really well and spread virally, and the type of stuff that like worker bee is gonna forward off to their friend or loved one, is joke a day. You got a setup, punchline, story, setup, punchline, setup, story, punchline. I forgot the structure of a joke, which is why I don't do a joke a day comic. But yeah, you'll find these come up in a whole bunch of different formats. Some of them are strip format, where you have like 4 or 5 panels like you'd find in a newspaper. Newspaper comics are joke a day. Well, some of them are joke a day. Some of them you don't know why they're still fucking being published, but that's a discussion for later. But yeah, so generally it's a joke a day. Gaming humor tends to do well. Things like Penny Arcade, XKCD, nerd geeky humor, that's definitely joke a day. I think XKCD changes format depending on the joke. Like sometimes he'll do a single panel, sometimes he'll do like a strip type deal, sometimes he'll do a long page. But you can do that when you're on the web. But the most common, the most bang for your buck, if you're just looking to get your stuff out there to the widest audience possible, joke a day is the way to go. There are certainly story comics, more narrative comics, and these usually mirror real world, not real world. These usually mirror print comics. So you usually get a full page per upload, so you'll have to scroll down. Joke a day can tend to fit in one screen if it's a strip format. If it's a narrative, a continual narrative, some cartoonists still draw it like they would a regular comic page, 11 by 17, scan it and upload it for the web, and then print it out. There are some cartoonists who are pretty smart and format their storyline strips to fit within a browser window or an iPad or something like that. So that's pretty cool. But the disadvantage for narrative comics, for story comics, is that since you are updating a page at a time, well, a lot of them update a page at a time. And since you're not updating every day, and sometimes you miss updates, your fans can kind of obsess over what goes on in one page, and then have huge internet arguments over what goes on in one page, instead of waiting for the entire story to come out at once and then read it as a chunk. Like you rarely have people in a comic book store rip out a page of a comic and just spend hours and hours yelling about that. That rarely happens in a comic book store. That will happen online. So if you are aiming to do a long form narrative comic, be aware that sometimes if your fans get really, really, really into it, every page you update will be analyzed to death. And you know, read comments with many grains of salt, because you know, something that your fans are obsessing over in this one page may be addressed in the next page, or it may be addressed pages down the line. But you don't want to compromise your story just to appease the online discussion, because when it's read in a chunk, it's gonna feel janky. So if you have a vision and you're doing a long form story, stick with it. You know, don't give in. It's tough. It can be tough because there's a lot of pressure when you're interacting so frequently online with people, and you don't want to spoil things. But it'll be a stronger story. You'll have a stronger story in the end, and I think your readers will definitely appreciate where you take things, rather than trying to second guess yourself to answer all these questions that aren't being answered. So those are the two major styles of comic. They come in many different formats. So I've mentioned the strip format, which is easy to fit on a browser. I've mentioned the full page format. I've mentioned people formatting things for browsers. So whether it's story or joke a day, comics can come in any kind of form. Now there's a concept that Scott McCloud, and we're bringing it back to Scott McCloud, in his book Reinventing Comics, he came up with this idea called the infinite canvas. And you don't hear about this shit anymore because people tried to use it and it didn't fucking work for them. But basically, the idea is that since you are on the web, you are no longer constrained by the borders of an 8.5-11 piece of paper, or a piece of paper. Like, you know, whereas if you're doing a newspaper strip format comic, you've got this bound to work in. If you're doing a comic page, you've got this bound to work in. On the internet, there are no bounds. You can have a page that scrolls all the way to this end and then all the way to the other end and goes up and down and zooms in and zooms out. You can have animations and all this other fucking bullshit. And thus was birthed the concept of the infinite canvas. And in theory, it is great because on the internet, you can do whatever the fuck you want. And even now with HTML5, you have many more widgets and tools and actions that are at your disposals to make your content more immersive, more playable. You can give the audience member chances to fuck with your shit and move it how they want to. The problem is, while these format things are really interesting and really fun to fuck with, you have to keep in mind the end user. And the end user, the reader who's coming to your comic, just the casual person who's logging in and finds your comic, probably isn't interested in scrolling all over here and playing with your comic to figure out what the fuck is going on. If you confuse the reader, no one's gonna read your shit. And a lot of people who jumped on the infinite canvas bandwagon early on ended up confusing a lot of their readers. And there's an additional problem when it comes to trying to monetize an infinite canvas comic. If you would like to sell print collections of your infinite canvas, you've got to reformat this sprawling thing into a book. And that doesn't always happen. That doesn't always translate well. Like if you have some sweet animations, you can't do animations in a paper book. You can do animations on an iPad. So perhaps there's a perhaps the iPad can birth a new resurgence of the infinite canvas idea. Like you could do animations in ebooks, which would be kind of really cool. But the other problem with infinite canvas is sometimes these neat things that you're trying take a lot more time to do than just putting your stuff out there. So there are very few comics now today that are infinite canvas. Possibly the only comic out there that has done this successfully, and I would say wildly successfully, is Homestuck. Homestuck takes the idea of doing whatever you want to on the net and using the net and leveraging the power of the internet to whole new levels. Like, Hussey has animations, he has music, he has GIFs, he has Flash, he's got, you know, regular updates, he's got all sorts of different formats spanning updates. So I think it's a tough concept to sell, but and I don't know that you could bottle Homestuck's success and try it on your own without such a massive fan base, because you know, people who go to the net, we're kind of creatures of habit. If we're confronted with something new, it doesn't always sit well. So, you know, we've got our scroll wheel and we can read down, we can read across, and that's kind of what we're used to. So if you do mess with infinite canvas, I would highly recommend doing things for the iPad, because you know, or any of the touch devices or the tablet devices, because that I think if the concept of the infinite canvas had come out when all these touch screens were available, I think many more people would have adopted it, because if you do want to monetize, it's easy to sell an app these days. Back when the infinite canvas idea first came out, it was tough as shit. The only way to monetize stuff was to sell like t-shirts or books, and you can't do that with an infinite canvas. But now with the app generation and apps and smart tabs and all this kind of bullshit, it's not bullshit, all this great stuff, you can format your infinite canvas into an app and then let people play with it on the tablet. So I think it's going to take a while before we see something like an infinite canvas implementation, but I think the touch screen is the perfect platform for that kind of stuff. So yeah, so we've got strips, we've got pages, we've got infinite canvas. Something that you don't often see in webcomics, but is certainly easy to do, is the political cartoon style comic, or the one panel kind of comic with the caption at the bottom. That's really easy to do. It's really easy to make. It's really easy to send around. You often see that in the form of a meme. I don't necessarily consider memes to be comics, but I guess you could, because it's got illustrations or pictures with words across them, but you know, you don't see many illustrated versions of that kind of stuff. But yeah, the political cartoons are really easy to do and really easy to put up online, and they spread very quickly, like Tumblr and things like that, because it's easy to digest. You just shoot it off to a friend. A lot of political cartoonists have their own website now, because of the nature of papers and things like that. So some of your favorite political cartoonists are online and doing their own stuff. They don't consider it webcomics, but they are publishing on the web. So so those are all the formats that I've seen that I can think of that are fun to play with and fun to mess around with. Generally, when you start out, you're either gonna, most web cartoonists I know start out with like a joke a day kind of thing, and it's usually two dudes on a couch playing video games or some iteration thereof. Because story comics take a long time to develop, and a long time to gain an audience. And those, if you're not ready if you don't have that endurance, it can be kind of a daunting task. So most people start out with a joke a day and then decide, all right, I've got a handle on this bullshit. Let me see if I can do something more of my style. Sometimes you'll find smaller comics like office strips that'll have a continual narrative, or joke a day type style comics that have a continual narrative, which is kind of cool. I think PvP does that. Girls with Slingshots does that. Bad Machinery does that. There's a continual narrative. There's a joke in every strip, but those strips also have a continual narrative. So it's kind of like a hybrid, continual storyline plus joke a day. So the great thing about publishing comics online is that you can experiment with all of these formats, all of these styles, all of these platforms, the thing you want to keep in mind is that you want to tell a good story for the reader. And if the reader can't get your content, if your interface is interfering with their ability to read stuff, if you're doing all sorts of cool widgets but they can't figure out how to go next or do an archive dive, no one's gonna give a fuck. So whenever you're constructing your comic, whenever you're doing stuff online, whenever you're putting stuff out there, sure, you have all these powerful tools available to you, but if the reader can't read your fucking thing, they're not gonna. So just keep that in mind if you do decide to experiment with some of these other technologies. I think it's great, and if I knew more about programming, I would be doing more fun things on my site. Like, I still need to code a mobile version so that you don't have to zoom in on every panel when you look at my comic on a phone. That would be really cool. I wish I knew how to do that, and well, I do know how to do that to a certain extent, but I wish I had time. That's the other thing. When you experiment, it takes time. So if you're in the middle of your comic and you've got an audience, maybe that's not the best time to experiment. But if you're just starting out, you can keep all of these cool ideas in mind, build it that way, and then, you know, try to see how far you can get with that. So I'm gonna stop now because I sound like I'm rambling, but hopefully I answered your question somehow, Courtney, I hope, and maybe some of you found this useful. So thanks for checking it out, and I'll check you later. Bye.